Center for China and Globalization webinar series. Today, our topic is of profound importance and urgency. We are going to discuss Afghanistan, the road ahead. It is obviously clear that 2 decades of war, or rather 4 decades of war, have ended in Afghanistan, but the country is far from peace and stability. There is a surging humanitarian crisis that is turning into a catastrophe with increasing speed. And about 40 million Afghans are at the verge of starvation. There is a tough winter ahead. So the real questions that we are going to try and answer today are: what happened, what lessons can be learned, and most importantly, given the urgency of the current situation, what can be done by the international community to make a difference? And also, what are lasting solutions? Here we can also talk about concepts like the Belt and Road Initiative and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And last but not the least, there is an important youth dimension to be addressed and understood. 67% of Afghans are below the age of 25. So how can the young people be engaged in a more effective way? How can they be included in the process of building towards a better future for the people of Afghanistan? And to discuss this topic, we have with us a panel with great experience from 3 different time zones and different nationalities who will bring many perspectives and help us try and understand what is happening and how can the global community play a more conducive role. So firstly, we have with us Ambassador Umar Samad, who is non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Welcome. We have Professor Joseph Mahoney, Professor of Politics and International Relations at East China Normal University, Shanghai. We have with us Dr. Chao Hai, Senior Research Fellow, Grandview Institution. Mr. Ijaz Heather, Senior Scholar and Security Expert from Pakistan. Mr. Musharraf Zaidi, Senior Fellow, Tabad Lab. Mr. Wahid Ahmadzai, Founder and CEO of NHub. And as discussants, we are very glad to be joined by Mr. Mike Liu, Vice President and Senior Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, Dr. Lu Yang, Research Fellow at the Belt and Road Institute at Tsinghua University, and Mr. Andrew Mock, Senior Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. So our topics is going to be based on 6 different discussion points. Firstly, what are the reasons behind the current crisis? Secondly, left unaddressed, what can the regional and global ramifications be? Thirdly, how can the world play a more conducive role in the short and the long run? Fourthly, certain steps that have been taken so far. For instance, aid has been released by the United Nations. Trade with China is ongoing, and there was recently an OIC summit held in Islamabad. What are the outcomes of these initiatives, and what can they actually achieve in tangible terms? And also, how can we scale successful efforts? Fifthly, we will talk about long-term solutions, and lastly, how to better engage and mobilize young people. I'm Zoon Ahmed Khan, Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, and I will be the host for today's discussion. Without further ado, let me invite Ambassador Umar Asad, a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council. Ambassador Asad has previously served as ambassador to Belgium, France, and also Canada. He is participating frequently in different conversations on media and think tank platforms, and he has so far helped the global community understand Afghanistan in a better way. So Ambassador, the floor is yours. You're muted.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you to CCG and to you, Zoon Ahmed Khan. And my greetings to all the panelists and the discussants. I've been told that I have between 8 to 10 minutes to go over several key critical issues. So I will just dive into this and not lose time. As an Afghan who has been following events in my country for more than 4 decades, what happened obviously this year was shocking, but also something that personally I foresaw coming, not the way it happened, but as an alternative to a peace settlement. It is unfortunate that we were not able to reach a peace and a political settlement in Doha, but I will get to that later. Let me just go quickly over a few reasons why I think we had a debacle in Afghanistan, and a regime collapse in Kabul and a American withdrawal the way it happened, and as well as NATO withdrawal. I think that looking back at the last 20 years, obviously the last 20 years are very much connected to the previous 20 years of Afghanistan, or 22 years of Afghanistan's history, starting with the communist coup in 1978 and the Soviet invasion uh, in December of 27, this week, 42 years ago. Uh, the American, the post 9/11 intervention, obviously, had its own logic. Uh, could there have been other ways of handling it? Yes, but that decision was taken to rebuild Afghanistan uh, after having failed to do so after the Soviets left. But unfortunately, looking back, I would say that we failed to have strategic vision and consistency from the internationals as well as Afghan leaders. We also had weak Afghan ownership beyond what the upper elites were providing. And we were not able over 20 years to increase the level of self-reliance and, for example, replace the 80% dependency that the Afghan government had on foreign donations and the support of the budget. Peace and reconciliation, which should have been a key issue from the very beginning, became slogans, unfortunately, and a pretext for maintaining a status quo, a military status quo. And so many opportunities were missed from 2002 until 2018, when the Americans started to get more serious about peace talks. And we know what happened in that interval. I was a witness to the fact that state building and nation building, two key components of a recovery, lacked a foundation that involved the Afghan people themselves. And so there was no strategic pathway in that regard. Reconstruction and development priorities were intertwined with contracting and multiple donors with their own agendas, and a Afghan government or Afghan entity as recipient lacking accountability, which unfortunately fueled corruption at the highest levels. Even today, there was news that an anti-corruption organization named Ashraf Ghani as one of the top 5 most corrupt individuals in the world, something that should have been done years ago. The military mission superseded other missions, the mission of rebuilding in Afghanistan, and it became the main driver of the international presence. That should have been the opposite, where the military mission over time should have been reduced. It was, but the combat mission ended in 2014, but then the American and NATO military operations in support of the Ghani government continued almost till the last week before the fall of Kabul. The other thing that I think caused this collapse was the fact that the Afghan population, the Afghan people, over time, instead of the terrorist organizations, instead of those who were seen as spoilers or a threat, a real threat to security, the Afghan population became a target and a victim of the ongoing war. And as a result, the so-called Hearts and Minds campaign failed miserably, actually, and more and more communities across Afghanistan, not just in the Pashtun tribal belts, but across Afghanistan, turned against the mission and against the government that they saw as being very corrupt at the same time. And they started losing faith in the nascent young democracy, especially the majority, 70% of the young Afghans who had an opportunity to have an education, unfortunately lost faith in democracy because they saw huge discrepancies and elections that were highly fraudulent and undermined the people's will. So that became a problem. So we have a lot of other reasons, and I'm not going to go into that. I'll quickly jump into what is the situation now and what should be done. There are three main players. Obviously, there's the Afghan entity, the Afghan players, and the Taliban right now are in control, full control of the country, and they are the key player. As much as others would want to also be engaged, but the Taliban are very slow in engaging other Afghan players at the moment. So for the Taliban, I think that they need to adhere to some of the key pledges that they had made in Doha before the fall of Kabul, especially in regards to pursuing a political settlement path, leading to a more legitimate order in Afghanistan that is not only broad-based, but also reflective of the complex Afghan society and political constituencies. They also need to resolve what seems to be some of their own internal debates and some differences of opinion that have emerged over time, even though they're very good at masking them, on key issues that are preventing stronger cohesion and inclusivity, as well as raising questions in the international community, especially, as well as amongst the Afghan population, about their convictions and their commitment to human rights values, even if given an Islamic framework, and to women's rights and minority rights, especially when it comes to access to education and employment. So all of these issues, whether they are from a international law perspective or Islamic law perspective, are not very clear yet as far as the Taliban are concerned. I think that what is also important for the Taliban to realize is that they need to engage other Afghan players in order to prevent Afghanistan from becoming an international ward and a UN NGO run, de facto managed and run entity. Afghanistan is a country that needs to have a sovereign government, a representative government to the extent possible, where the Taliban and others can agree on power sharing or any type of political order that can have a majority support. Let me jump to the region quickly. The region is extremely important. 6 important neighbors of Afghanistan and other stakeholders beyond. But very quickly, I think I want to say that it has become obvious that in the region and in the neighborhood of Afghanistan, almost everyone wants stability. They're very fearful of instability in Afghanistan and understand what the consequences and ramification could be. And I think that there's a need for threat mitigation, threats such as different forms of terrorism to different countries surrounding Afghanistan, threats from the drug and narcotics business, and criminality, as well as the threat of millions of Afghans continuing to leave the country in a mass exodus that could in itself create a lot of issues regionally and beyond. So I think that working on a counterterrorism coordinated strategy and counter-narcotic strategy at the regional level is going to be very important, both for the Taliban in order for them to assure others of their credentials, as well as in return for the regional players to make sure that they can help in the Taliban achieve those goals. There's also a vital need to reactivate and revive the Afghan economy. This economy now has tanked. It has collapsed. It has given way to more than 25 million Afghans facing starvation. An economy that was very much dependent on international aid is now very much still in need of international aid on the humanitarian side. Everything else has stopped there's no more funding streams for anything that has to do with reconstruction or other projects in Afghanistan. Which brings us to the third element before I stop, that has to do with the key donors and key international organizations and key NGOs, and obviously those who over the last 20 years have played a critical role in funding Afghanistan's re-emergence and revival and reconstruction. They were the main funding providers till August 15th. Since then, they stopped all operations except for the focus on humanitarian assistance to make sure that the Afghans do not die of starvation at this point. We need more engagement in this regard between the Taliban and other players. There is a loss of trust. We need trust building, and we need a new paradigm. There's obviously a consensus still holding that they will not recognize officially the Taliban government. That also passes through the United Nations Security Council and the P5. I'm not sure exactly how long the P5 is going to hold on this, whether China or Russia or both of them may use their veto power. But obviously, it's a very complex situation from a geopolitical perspective, and the fact that the Taliban are still on the sanctions list and they're blacklisted in different ways. But what has happened in Afghanistan to the Afghan people is man-made. It is also very political. If the Taliban decide to solve some of the issues that have to do with governance and broad-based government, as well as try to address the issues of human rights and gender rights and minorities and others, and also be helpful to others in the fight against terrorism, then obviously the political issue should and would be resolved for most of the international players. And then that should open the path for recognition. But we are not there yet. We are not sure if that is going to change anytime soon. My thought is that there's a 6-month window open right now for the Taliban to show some flexibility, and for the international community as well to show some openness and engagement and moving towards something more normal. I will stop here since there's a lot more to talk about, and hopefully address some of the questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Umar, and giving a historic perspective, what the reality was, maybe also helping us diagnose some of the issues that we are seeing today, what was the cause behind them, and also talking about what is at stake for the region and possible ways forward. Both sides, Taliban as well as the world, need to show flexibility, and a consensus among Afghan people and their inclusion will be very important moving forward in helping Afghanistan become a less reliant country and one that is progressing economically and otherwise. So thank you so much. Now let's invite Professor Joseph Mahoney, Professor of Politics and International Relations at East China Normal University in Shanghai. And he has more than 170 publications and is also winner of multiple teaching and research awards. He is frequently seen on global media as well as think tanks discussing issues of overall geopolitics from a historical perspective. And today, Professor Joseph, we are looking forward to understanding what happened over these years and what are possible ways forward for Afghanistan. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Zune, and thanks to CCG for inviting me. I'm pleased to join this discussion. My purpose here will be to talk about it in broad strokes, but also to try to frame my discussion in terms and concepts that should be familiar to Beijing, and why I do that will become apparent in a few moments. I've prepared a document. I've sent it to Zune. If she wants to distribute it to others, that's her prerogative. So let me begin with the first question. Why did the US-supported Afghan government collapse so quickly? This seems to be something that a lot of people are interested in. Now, there are numerous studies underway trying to determine why the US-supported government collapsed so quickly, but we should not be distracted by academic questions like these. The Afghan people are in the midst of a crisis, and while understanding how they reached this point might help us fashion better responses, no clear answers, let alone broad consensus on this question, will be available anytime soon. Indeed, even the U.S. Inspector General responsible for investigating the rapid collapse has complained his study is near impossible given the secrecy surrounding U.S. policymaking and assessments over the two-decade-plus invasion and occupation. Nevertheless, it is reasonable to offer a number of tentative conclusions about the collapse. These, in turn, may prove instrumental as we consider international responses to the unfolding crisis. Now, here are the key points. First, the pre-US invasion Afghan state was already a failed state, or nearly so. How else should we describe the ongoing civil war, however minimize the state's increasing pariah status, or the fact that it hosted international terrorist organizations? Second, the regime put in place by the US was always a pseudo-state, an occupation regime notable for rampant corruption and failed governance despite billions in support from Washington. Now, preliminary studies indicate the regime failed largely because the US tried to impose American values and standards where they had significant material and cultural opposition. Other assessments indicate a great deal of the regime's corruption was caused by the US itself, and likewise notable for being so awful, it made the return of the Taliban preferable. Now, the only reason this state didn't collapse sooner is because the US didn't evacuate sooner. And the only reason we are surprised by the rapid collapse is because it appears rather obvious now that US assessments of the previous regime's strength were either gross miscalculations or misrepresentations. Third, in fact, it should be noted that Afghanistan has been in various states of collapse since the late 1970s, when the US financed jihadist resistance to Afghani socialism and Soviet support, and the Taliban today are the political and ideological descendants of those US efforts of destabilization. In short, this longstanding legacy of instability must be countered now with decisive actions or risk deepening crises with profound national, regional, and even global implications. Fourth, therefore, we cannot wait for a stable, legitimate state to emerge. The fact that one has not existed and is unlikely to manifest soon is the key problem. And in this respect, we might consider that perhaps the closest analog to the Afghan situation is Somalia. That's the sobering reality that confronts us in Kabul. Fifth, we cannot simply wash our hands of this matter and walk away. We need to understand that it is unreasonable and dangerous to expect the Afghans to solve their own problems internally at this point. Their problems stem substantially from decades of military interventions and occupations by global superpowers. And to expect the Afghans to clean up this mess by themselves, even if the sanctions regime is lifted, is begging for failure and tragedy. Next question. Should the Taliban government be recognized before major increases in international aid? Whether or not the Taliban are formally recognized belies the simple fact that they are a key stakeholder and an unavoidable partner to any meaningful international aid. We have invested the idea of formal recognition with too much significance and done so even more unhelpfully from the perspective of bilateral ties. For example, if we actually care about the Afghan people, and further, if we actually care about stability in Central Asia, then why should we withhold recognition or refuse to work with the Taliban in this period of humanitarian crisis? However, recognition need not be bilateral or a formal declaration tantamount to political and diplomatic support. Rather, a lesser form of tentative recognition can and should be offered multilaterally. For example, through a group like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This recognition could be limited simply to acknowledging the Taliban as a vital stakeholder when confronting this crisis without answering the broader questions of whether they have or will constitute a viable state worthy of formal diplomatic recognition. Taking this approach should minimize international criticism by firmly establishing a practical and defensible hierarchy of values. Next question. What about the particularly sensitive issue of restrictions imposed on women in Afghanistan? Without question, the fate of women and girls in Afghanistan under Taliban rule remains a serious concern and has been articulated thusly by many in the international community. However, as a first principle, we must recognize that women and girls are now at greater risk from humanitarian crisis than they are from facing exclusion from educational and occupational opportunities, general freedom of movement, and so on. Second, As a general rule, we must avoid the neo-colonial Orientalist trap of, quote, saving brown women from brown men, the so-called white man's burden approach that both past and present has been used by Western nations as moral justifications for numerous imperialist interventions. It is a proven fact that such interventions more often than not actually hurt women more than helps them. And this has been clearly demonstrated once again with the American experience in Afghanistan. Next point, the solution to this crisis can only be found through a multilateral framework. Bilateral approaches are too risky in so much as they expose both sides to unacceptable political risk. These include general concerns related to diplomatic face, but more importantly, failing to include the multitude of stakeholders in a collective framework can invite more insecurity. Of course, the even greater risk associated with a bilateral response is an ineffective response to the crisis, one that might make the crisis even worse. Consequently, employing a multilateral framework is likely the best way forward. From the Chinese perspective, this approach also aligns with Beijing's repeated emphasis on using multilateralism in international affairs. From the international perspective, it would create more legitimacy, share the burden and risk among stakeholders, and ensure greater chances for success. It can also encourage better partnerships with other multilateral efforts, including potential alignments with the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and so on. It would seem the SCO offers the best existing multilateral organization for confronting the crisis and arguably should take the lead. However, the SCO might also request recognition and support from other multilateral organizations and invite observers to participate, including the UN, WHO, ASEAN, but also AIIB. While it might be too much front-loading to include these others, even in an observer capacity, the connections should be considered, above all with global level and Asian regional organizations. Ideally, this will be an Asian-based response with a global level legitimacy. Next question. Why is China the best candidate to serve as the core of a collective multilateral leadership approach? Perhaps no other country is better suited than China to lead this effort. Other major regional players, including Russia and Pakistan, have complicated histories with Afghanistan that will make it more difficult for them to lead or be accepted as leaders, both by stakeholders within Afghanistan, but also throughout the region. While China itself is not completely immune to such concerns, none other has a cleaner diplomatic slate or comparable capacity. Additionally, only China has both the political and logistical capacity to lead among the major regional powers. Furthermore, it has a suitable, ready-made IR philosophy of promoting multilateralism and avoiding interference and hegemony, promoting win-win solutions, and a shared destiny for humanity. China likewise has considerable depth in terms of vital resources related to aid and development and can call on other multilateral support or initiatives like BRI to help out. Perhaps most importantly, China is unmatched in terms of crisis management experience, and its experience in Central Asia has grown substantially in recent years. And finally, it has already established positive connections with Taliban leadership while maintaining a general neutrality towards stakeholders competing with the Taliban. We have noted thus far the necessity of a multilateral approach, but experience indicates at least one capable nation should stand firm at the core or center of the effort. In fact, this is not just an international principle, but one that is intrinsic to the Chinese political system, along with the idea of collective shared responsibility and the deep experience of creating and sustaining united fronts, even among enemies and competing interests in times of crises. In short, the Chinese model of collective leadership with a strong center can be adapted to the sort of consensus building but results-oriented approaches that this crisis demands. While there are risks, and all the more so with the need for speed to counter the emergency, no one can offer better core leadership, and this presents Beijing and the region with a compelling humanitarian call for action. Now, finally, in closing, I would like to consider the Xinjiang Afghanistan dialectic. And we should note the dialectic of Xinjiang and Afghanistan. It should be clear that the unfounded American and British allegations of genocide in Xinjiang were perhaps conceived as an anti-China propaganda strategy to cover domestic and international failures experienced by both countries, including several of which intersect with each other, be they Brexit, failures to contain COVID-19, Trump's failed trade war, and so on. But above all, to cover the catastrophe of the American-led intervention and withdrawal from Afghanistan. In other words, when Trump announces that he's pulling out of Afghanistan, this is when we really begin to see the promotion of this Xinjiang narrative out of Washington. So indeed, allegations of genocide accelerated with Trump's announced withdrawal, along with his failed trade war and his desire to escape Beijing for his governance failures associated with the outbreak. Biden and other Western leaders have continued this narrative unsurprisingly. That false claims of genocide in Xinjiang are advanced to cover the real tragedies of Western policies in Afghanistan will leave historians shaking their heads. But suffice to say, by China taking a lead in helping to resolve the humanitarian crisis and human rights abuses associated with Western imperialism in Afghanistan, this would be a major win for the Afghan people, the region, and Beijing's international standing. Nothing pushes back against allegations of human rights violations better than actually protecting human rights, particularly when those were abused by Western nations in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mahoney. There's so many points I would like to recap quickly because I feel our next panelists would also like to address some of those questions. But I think especially the part where Taliban at least need to be treated as stakeholders to make humanitarian aid and efforts possible. And I also appreciate that, for instance, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as with especially the 9 members, now Iran is also a member, are all neighbors, mostly neighbors of Afghanistan. So we are direct stakeholders, we are directly affected, and we have been affected by the situation. And also what role China can play long-term infrastructure, stability, connectivity. This is part of the Belt and Road Vision and also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization vision. Thank you so much. Now, without further ado, let's invite Dr. Zhao Hai of Grandview Institution. He is Senior Fellow and member of the Academic Committee of Grandview Institution and also the Director of International Political Studies at the National Institute for Global Strategy, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Dr. Zhao has previously also worked at the National Strategy Institute in Tsinghua University and holds a PhD in International History from the University of Chicago. The floor is yours, Dr. Zhao. You can address some of the previous speakers and also offer your perspective on the questions we are trying to address.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for CCG's invitation, and I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with a group of excellent experts on Afghanistan. Personally, I'm not an expert on Afghanistan affairs. I just do international relations studies, and actually, Professor Mahoney's points have some overlapping with mine. It's great to hear from you and actually verifying some of my positions. But after that, I think we need to also, not only address that whether or not China should be a core leader in a multilateral effort to try to help Afghanistan people, but at the same time, I want to address the concerns from the Chinese perspective and also the decision process where China wanted to make the decision whether or not or from what position to better serve the purpose of try to resolve the humanitarian crisis that is currently going on in Afghanistan. First of all, I wanted to say that the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is actually serving the grand strategy of the United States, trying to focus on China. As the professor pointed out, that this withdrawal is a disaster. However, from American perspective, focusing more resources, strategic resources towards Indo-Pacific and try to pressure China from that point will better serve U.S. national strategy rather than continue to put resource into Afghanistan and maintain a failed state. So that's where the U.S. policy is initiated. And the Chinese, of course, opposed this hasty withdrawal and worried about the aftermath of that withdrawal. And currently we're saying the destabilizing factors are rising, and also China is very much concerned that the rising destability in the country will lead to more terrorist groups working under that environment, and that will destabilizing not only Afghanistan but has regional implications, including Central Asia and Pakistan, neighboring Pakistan and other countries. And those countries are very important for China's BRI because Belt and Road is going through those regions, and we have very important investments in those areas. So we have a vested interest to maintain stability in the region. And secondly, I think right now, China's number one top concern is not exactly terrorist organizations like ETIM in Afghanistan, because we know there's only a couple of hundreds remain in that country. However, that issue has been created as a wedge between Muslim countries, particularly Afghanistan and Taliban with China, because recently rumors are rising in Afghanistan saying that whatever China is doing in Xinjiang and China's request to clean ETIM from Afghanistan is it's a sign of repression of Muslim and sort of rebellion in the region, therefore trying to disseminate this message that China is essentially not a friend to Afghanistan or to other Muslim countries. And that message is sort of spreading also in China, incurring a lot of concerns in China. What if China continue or increase its activity in Afghanistan, that may lead to potential terrorist activities against China, just like what happened this year and last year in Pakistan. And number three, I agree with the professor that China's current approach, its policy, is determined from the very beginning after the US determination to withdraw, that China should approach Afghanistan through a multilateral platform, but also from a bilateral approach. The multilateral, of course, going through the SCO and other newly created multilateral coordination platforms led by Pakistan, Russia, and also by China. However, we're still trying to figure out which multilateral organization is better positioned to address the issue and to pour more resource to help Afghanistan. At the same time, of course, we've witnessed that China is approaching this from bilateral perspective as well. For instance, putting humanitarian aid directly into Afghanistan. For instance, like financing, giving humanitarian aid in terms of vaccines, in terms of food, and other humanitarian resources, going through the train, freight train, and also other means like flight. But currently, that infrastructure is not working properly. We can only move very little resource through that infrastructure, and it's not enough to actually solve the ongoing humanitarian crisis. We need more channels going not only from China, but also through Pakistan, through Iran, and also Central Asia countries, multiple ways to move resources into the country so that to help people to go through the winter. And the next point is that right now, even though that experts wanted China to play a larger role in terms of helping Afghanistan, however, there's still lack of understanding and support domestically within China. Because as you all know, even though Afghanistan is a neighboring country to China, but the Chinese society in general has very little understanding of Afghanistan's history and what its people is currently going through. Recently, there's a report just came out 2 days ago about a group of Chinese observers going through provinces in Afghanistan. They traveled 29 days, and they were interviewed by Chinese domestic media, and now their interview is online. There are more and more people are reading this and have a better understanding of what exactly is going on in Afghanistan. Because previously, Taliban has a pretty bad name in China, and Chinese people have fear about their extreme views about Muslim belief and also their activities in terms of oppression of women and other activities. So to help Chinese people to better understand exactly what's going on the ground is a way to have more support domestically for China to provide more aid into Afghanistan. However, at this point, I think that's still lacking. So in order for the Chinese government to act more decisively, it is imperative to have more media report from inside of Afghanistan and to paint a better picture for understanding of what exactly is going through in that country. And the last one is that China has contributed to a certain extent to Afghanistan's rebuilding. And there's already projects within Afghanistan, including BRI projects. There are designs to extend BRI from CPAC into Afghanistan as well. However, at this point, the Chinese companies are not willing to put money, resource, human capital into that country because of concern of security, of instability, and of the current government's legitimacy. So in order for the economy to go back on track and particularly attract more Chinese capital to go into that country, it is very important for the current Taliban government to actually make progress in building a more inclusive government and have a better relationship with international community so that the Chinese government can actually have a better sort of support from the neighboring countries and also from the global community, and also have more guarantees for their investment in that country. And lastly, I wanted to emphasize that China has made it clear that it has no, like the professor pointed out, vested interest in that country and do not need to, and does not have the will to intervene into domestic affairs in Afghanistan. So purely from a China's internal perspective, to maintain stability in Afghanistan is top priority right now. For Afghanistan to go through this winter, we're still calculating exactly how much resource the Afghan government right now needs and to what extent China and other countries can contribute. Right now, a better way to do that through multilateral platform is to attract and is to restore, number one, US, EU, and other Western countries' financial support to that country. And number two, to involve Gulf countries, those countries that has enough resource and money to come in and support Afghanistan. And number three, to rally all the neighboring countries for their own interest to pour more resource into the country. I think without collective action with all those parties involved, it is impossible at this point to support close to 40 million people to go through this hard winter. I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to more discussion on Chinese positions in Afghanistan's affairs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Zhao, for really offering what is the position and perspective from China right now. I'll quickly also talk about the kind of coverage that is being done globally. So we are talking a lot about a humanitarian crisis unfolding and that the situation is very dire, but really zooming into how exactly people are suffering, maybe examples of initiatives. For example, the ICRC is doing something quite effectively with the current Ministry of Public Health in Afghanistan. These examples of positive collaboration that are making an impact and actually seeing up close what the situation is can help mobilize support for Afghan people. The group of Chinese you talked about that travel through, I think that kind of coverage and reporting can also be more effective than just broadly talking about the issue. Here, I think also the parts where you mentioned how the global community can help restoring some of the previous aid that was going to Afghanistan, and also the role of Gulf countries and the neighbors. So I guess the recent OIC summit in Islamabad can also be something worth mentioning and talking about, which is why we have next Mr. Ijaz Haider, who will particularly be also touching the impact of the summit. So Ijaz Haider is I'll briefly introduce you and then the floor is yours. He was most recently executive editor at Indus News and hosted a policy show In Focus. And he started his career as a newspaperman and held editorial positions for leading Pakistani publications and newspapers, including the Frontier Post, Lahore, the Friday Times, and Daily Times. And he was also previously a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington. So Mr. Ijaz Haider, the floor is yours, 8 to 10 minutes, an overall perspective, but also what is the impact of recent initiatives and what are possible solutions, really. We've deconstructed a lot of what's happening, different perspectives. If we can also find ways to enable better cooperation within the region and the international community. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoon. Thank you also to CCG for this invitation. I heard the previous speakers. I also received this message from you on the sidelines asking if I have any solutions, if I can offer any solutions. Well, it's a wicked problem, and I don't think that there are any real solutions in terms of a package which can be presented to the world, or something that can basically ameliorate the situation unfolding on the ground in Afghanistan. But I think this is a situation that needs to be tackled from issue to issue. I would actually want to take the conversation to move beyond what has happened and how Afghanistan, the region, and the world have got to this point. I think there's been a lot of discussion on that, a lot of pages and even books and analyses have been written, are being written. The fact is that the Taliban are in power, they own the ground, and they have to meet certain standards in order for the world to move towards recognizing and granting them legitimacy. We saw, unfortunately, some sentiment in Pakistan after the fall of Kabul, which was euphoric. I've always thought that that was misplaced. And in the next few minutes, I'd like to sort of, inform the colleagues here that the situation for Pakistan has not really changed much in terms of the threats that emanated from Afghanistan and would continue to emanate from Pakistan. That said, Pakistan remains committed to diplomatic efforts to address the situation there, essentially to get a broad regional consensus on a coordinated approach. There have been multiple initiatives, conferences, meets, and we know that Pakistan has been taking the lead in most of them. And in doing so, it is dealing with other state actors that have their own interests and preferences, which may or may not be entirely in sync with Pakistan's, or for that matter, even Afghanistan's. Some regional countries have talked about broad-based and inclusive government. Some have stressed the need to have a government of national reconciliation. Islamabad has constantly and consistently talked about a broad-based inclusive government. As a matter of fact, we can go back to the Bonn process. Pakistan, even at that time, had insisted that the Bonn process should include all the stakeholders, including constituencies that are represented by the Taliban. That did not happen. We also know that in 2004, it's a matter of record that Lakhdar Brahimi, in an interview, talked about the fact that not being able to pull those constituencies into that process was what he called the original sin. So anyway, at the same time, Pakistan has stressed the need to take a realistic approach in view of the changed reality in Afghanistan. And the recent OIC meet was also directed towards that end. Now, Pakistan has three immediate concerns. It needs to continue to monitor and work with the Taliban interim government, assist Afghanistan as much as Pakistan can do, which Pakistan is doing. And I'm referring to Afghanistan's humanitarian needs. To this end, Pakistan has also called upon the world community to share that burden. The previous speakers have also talked about a multilateral approach to that end. Of course, it's not simply because of altruism, because connected to that, there's a problem of refugees. We already have millions of them in Pakistan, and they need to go back. And we don't want the situation to turn so dire that there is more influx of refugees in Pakistan, which of course is not just an issue of economic burden, but also becomes a hard security problem. And third, Pakistan continues to nudge the Taliban leadership to reach out to other stakeholders, i.e. political and ethnic groups. This is essentially about working out a political arrangement that reflects the diversity of Afghanistan. At the time of announcement about formation of an interim political setup in Kabul, which was last September, Pakistan had officially stated that such a setup must address the requirement of a governance structure to meet the urgent needs of the people of Afghanistan. Now, that statement meant A, that Pakistan wants to stay connected with what's on the ground because that's the only setup in and through which it can be useful. And B, expects that the interim arrangement will address the requirement of a governance structure that reflects the needs of the people of Afghanistan. Much of what Pakistan wants has not happened. It's not clear how much of what Pakistan wants, as also other states in the region beyond, could or will happen. But Pakistan has to grapple with what the US and its coalition have left behind, and also the history between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So while the US and its coalition partners were still in Afghanistan, Pakistan's main concerns were the continuing resistance by the Afghans to accepting the border. They continue to refer to it as the Durand Line. Pakistan was also concerned about India's activities in collusion with the Afghan National Directorate of Security to wage a covert war against Pakistan, especially by supporting Baloch terrorist groups. Has that changed? Unfortunately, not really. The Durand Line problem persists, as has been evident from events in the past few days with reference to fencing on the border. Taliban fighters took away rolls of concertina wire and also threatened Pakistani soldiers. And this is on video. In one incident earlier, Taliban fighters removed the Pakistan flag from trucks that were carrying humanitarian aid for Afghanistan. In the recent incident, the fencing incident that I talked about, it seems that Pakistan has tried to defuse the situation by agreeing to a consensual approach to fencing. Personally, I consider that to be a mistake with the potential of becoming a big mistake. It is ironic that Afghan irredentism, which has been a major cause of troubles between Pakistan and Afghanistan, continues. A couple of months before the fall of Kabul, Ashraf Ghani, who abdicated his office and slipped into the night, inaugurated an airport in Khost. Speaking on that occasion, he actually called upon the Taliban. This was really ironic. And actually, at that time, I was doing my program at Indus News, and I actually had a segment on what he said, that if they were to come to power, they should not recognize the border with Pakistan. So this irredentism, this concern, which has always, in a major way, defined Afghanistan-Pakistan relations, is still there. Taliban have also reached out to India and got Pakistan to agree to allow transportation of Indian wheat overland in Afghan trucks. So I was speaking to one official who said to me, this looks like a one-off. So I said to that official, if he really thinks that this is going to be a one-off, he should go back to the Garden of Eden when the serpent wasn't there. We keep talking about how in many ways Afghanistan and Afghan youth have changed since the US invasion. That's of course an important observation. That also is the kind of human resource, frankly, that might ultimately become the foundation of modern Afghanistan. But we also forget that so have the Taliban. So while ideologically they remain where they are, or they were, the expression of that ideology has become more nuanced. They also realize that they have to utilize contacts with other states to get what they need. But whether they would play ball all the way is moot. And finally, Pakistan also faces a threat from the TTP and ISK, terrorist groups that are based in Afghanistan. So far, the Taliban have not moved against the TTP. Instead, they have been asking Pakistan to negotiate with them. Pakistan has tried that approach and it hasn't worked, and it's unlikely to work. I have my own view on how to deal with this issue. And as a matter of fact, my friend Musharraf Zaidi, who's also on the panel here, he and I had this public discussion on how to deal with this problem. But it's the current Pakistani approach, I don't think is going to work. I also believe that this problem should be and will become a litmus test of how Pakistan deals with the Taliban. So, we can have further discussion as we go into with the discussions coming in, and perhaps we can explore some of these ideas further. But final word that, as I said earlier, not much has changed in Afghanistan in terms of the threats. that were there. But what is further added now is a regime that has been, and can be regressive in its approaches to multiple issues. So threats plus a regressive attitude is likely to make it a toxic mix. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Actually, also, Mr. Heather, for a lot of people, the Pakistan-Afghanistan equation, what is the relationship? What are the mutual perceptions, especially from Pakistan, is something that is quite intriguing. And really dissecting that and explaining how things haven't changed much, I think it's especially informative given the current circumstances. I will quickly, before I go to Mr. Zaidi, Mr. Liu, Mr. Mike Liu, would you like, because if you need to leave early, would you like to join now, or we can go to Mr. Musharraf Zaidi first and then come to you?
Sure, Zong.
Yeah,
I can talk very briefly. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having me this morning. And it has been a very fascinating conversation on this very, I would say, complex case, right? If you look at what the things I see here is, number one, I suggest we need to take a structured approach. And this is an excellent opportunity to show the multilateralism, how we can join hands, with the global or international community to tackle this crisis, right? I look at, if I take a structured approach, we look at, definitely we have some short-term challenges. Well, winter is coming and the people there, they need the food, they need the medical supplies, they need some essential things to keep the life going, right? This time, I really, if under the international organization, across or maybe food app, and they know, they experience how to handle a crisis, and we have to make sure we do things from the beginning in a transparent and responsible manner, right? So that's very important to issue. We have sustainability to support the country, right? I look at the number two. If you look at I look at how we help the country to build up the necessary infrastructure, how we can promote the trade with the neighborhood country, with the different country around the world, how we can further help the country to build an engine to grow the economy, right? So I think right now the timing is everything, yeah. And if we really can, have a multilateralism organization or structure in place, really can help the things, get things up and running, that will be very crucial for the people in that country, right? That's my 2 cents here, Zoom.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mike Liu. That was one of our lead discussants, Mike Liu, also Vice President of CCG. Thank you for offering those suggestions. Timing is critical and vital given how the situation is unfolding. Now let's go to our next panelist from Pakistan, Mr. Musharraf Zaidi, who is a known public policy professional with over 2 decades of experience, and he deals with policy, politics, media, and economics. In 2014, he was honored by the World Economic Forum as a young global leader, and he has previously worked with the United Nations in Afghanistan, evaluating the state building portfolio of the UNDP. Musharraf Zaidi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zun, and thanks to CCG for organizing this important conversation. I'm really delighted to be on the same panel as my dear friend, Excellency Ambassador Omar Samad, of course, Ijaz Heather, and Joseph Mahoney, and others. I think so much has already been said, and there's very little with which one can disagree. So I'll keep my initial intervention relatively short, and I'll be happy to jump in during the kind of question and answer session or the discussion. But I think 3 or 4 things that if you step back and try to develop a little bit more distance from what has happened, and it's still very fresh and raw, what has happened in Afghanistan. It was just on the 15th of August that we were all talking about, we were still speculating as to what way things were going to go. And by the end of the day on the 16th or 17th, it was obvious that the Taliban were going to take over. It's only this week that we've had the UN Security Council and the US Treasury take decisions that will allow for humanitarian relief to get into Afghanistan without people needing to fear, sanctions, bringing sanctions upon themselves for dealing with the Haqqani network or the Taliban, both of which are UNSC 1267 sanctioned entities. But I think, like I said, if we step back a little bit, there's 3 or 4 kind of big ticket questions that Afghanistan generates that we really have to take very seriously in the region that we're talking about. I think the first is this idea of modern warfare, and this goes directly to the heart of the argument or the debate or the discussion that myself and Ijaz have had, but this is not a unique dichotomy of views among like-minded people. In the US, we had something called the right to the responsibility to protect kind of mantra that came out of the Rwanda genocide, and that was used in many instances to cite the need to initiate Chapter 7 and to intervene. So this idea of intervention as a principle espoused and agreed upon within the UN system, this really needs to be questioned given the record of these interventions. And I think the grand poobah in the Hall of Fame of these interventions is actually Afghanistan. So the idea was that modern warfare and the state in a box and the counterinsurgency doctrine and all of the, these were little fads that came and went across 2 decades. And all of them were supposed to redefine modern warfare so that there was less blood and more peace as a result of it. And post-conflict state building was supposed to be 5 State Department briefcases, 2 NGOs, a couple of natives like me who spoke English very well and understood all the modern terminology of statecraft. And we were supposed to be able to put together a modern state. We've not just seen that fail in Afghanistan, of course, we've seen that fail in every single instance of global intervention. And I think that, the tendency in certainly in Pakistan, I think maybe a little bit in China as well, which is understandable, is to point at the United States as the principal violator of some basic evidence when it comes to the results of intervention. But if you look at the intervention in Afghanistan, there was 48 countries that signed up to the military intervention. It wasn't just the US and the UK or just the English-speaking world or just the Europeans. Turkey was part of it. There were Arab nations and GCC member states that were part of it. So this grand coalition that intervened in Afghanistan because of 9/11 had no plan as to what to do once they took out the Taliban. And for 20 years, the international order sustained this intervention. The record of this intervention is before us. The exact same people that were running Afghanistan on September 10th, 2001 are running Afghanistan today. And all of the state building exercise that took place, what is its status? I think that's a legitimate question. Now, the easy answer, of course, is that it's dissipated or evaporated, but I think there are elements of the intervention that do need to be identified and pointed at. So for my money, I think that the National Solidarity Program and the Ministry of Rural Affairs and Regional Development in Afghanistan, some of the IDLG stuff, the local government stuff, a lot of the girls' education stuff, and certainly the development of urban Afghanistan, those are all things that we can point to and say, okay, in 20 years of intervention, these were some of the benefits that came about and some of the voices of resistance to the rights violations that the Taliban are committed to. And I think this is also important. This idea of a Taliban 2.0 or a new and reformed Taliban is a fallacious one, because the Taliban is not a political movement. It is an ideological movement with a political arm. And that means that unless it is true to its ideology, it will not be the Taliban. So the Taliban are not reformed per se. They have not become human rights defenders, and they will never be. They are defenders and advocates of what they stand for, which is a very orthodox, and I would say extreme interpretation of Islam, which is not followed by, I don't think, the majority of people in Afghanistan, and certainly not by the majority of Muslims all around the world. This kind of challenge is really secondary. I think the first point I had was about the international system and its failure. I think the second point is about state sovereignty. And this is a really critical point for people to remember for the region. State sovereignty, once compromised, is very much like Humpty Dumpty. It cannot be put together again. So if you try to draw the inferences or the derivative lessons from that, the one that screams out loudest to me is that the elites in this region have watched what has happened in Afghanistan, I think, very carefully. And so entrenched elites that are capable of drawing the right lessons will see that there is a regional and global interest in stability, number one. And if you look at, and this was a point that I think Professor Mahoney alluded to, and I think Umar Samad alluded to as well. The principal interest of the 6 neighboring countries or the wider region or the global community is that whatever happens in Afghanistan, the birth of another 9/11 should not, and counterterrorism is sacrosanct to China, to Pakistan, to Iran, to Tajikistan, to all of these countries. If that's the case, then we know for sure that our interest in the Afghan people is at best secondary, and I would say that's at best. But it is principally driven by the state interests of the countries that are looking at Afghanistan. This collective interest in stability can be a boon for entrenched elites if they play their cards right, but they must remember that the fate of the Ghani regime is the end result of an entrenched elite that fails to read the tea leaves and fails to act in a timely manner. So for me, while regional stability is sacrosanct for the region and for countries outside of Afghanistan, the lesson should be internal stability. That if you value the social and political construct that exists, where elite A or elite B or elite C is entrenched in power, then the interest that elite has in sustaining its own power should spur at least some reform. And I think this goes to a lot of what China in particular has tried to engage with, not just with Afghan elites, but I think with other countries too. And I certainly think that's the case with Pakistan. So I think lessons for the elite vis-a-vis state sovereignty are also, I think, quite important. And I think certainly for Pakistan, that holds true as it does for any other country. I think the third one is rather controversial, but I think this is an idea that many of us have discussed a lot more in private than we do in public here in Pakistan. But I think specific to Pakistan, one of the things that we should draw from what has happened in Afghanistan and what this all means for Pakistan is that, in my view, tentatively, and this is still I'm open to being challenged on this. In my view, it is Afghanistan and not India that is the defining theme for Pakistani national security. Now, this is a very major shift that I'm proposing has already happened, and I think there's some evidence to back up this idea or this notion. If you look at the kind of regime in Pakistan that has emerged, if you look at the emergence of a new national security discourse, including a formal national security policy that was approved just yesterday, but for a longer period of time, a discussion about what constitutes national security in Pakistan, the repeated emphasis is on geoeconomics rather than geopolitics or grand strategy. And I think that this indicates a certain shift in the mindset of the Pakistani elite, particularly the Pakistani military elite, but also the non-military elite. So when we think of the key divisions in Pakistan, of course, we think of civilian and military, and we think of extremist and non-extremist, and we think of urban and rural. But I think the most fundamental one might be the traditional elite and the emerging elite. And there's three facets of the emerging elite that are important, and they relate very, I think, very directly with Afghanistan. The first is that the emerging elite are, as I said, more likely to be urban than they are rural. The second is that there are more likely to be more females within this elite than there have ever been in Pakistan before. And the third is that they are more likely to speak Pashto than ever before. There's a final facet that connects this emerging elite in Pakistan to Afghanistan, and that is the demographic reality of Pakistan. The three countries that I think are most important in this region are Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Tajikistan. And the median age in these three countries, the highest median age is Pakistan's, and that too is below 23. Now, just for comparison's sake, if I'm not mistaken, the median age in China is above 37. These are not small differences. Even in Uzbekistan, the median age is above 30. So in Pakistan, the median age is 23, in Tajikistan, it's 22 and a half, and in Afghanistan, it's 18 and a half. What that means is that the next 20 or 30 years, these three countries, as opposed to other countries in the region. So again, to give another example, India's is, I believe it's 28, right? So it's still a young country, but the difference between Pakistan and India in terms of demographics, or the difference between Afghanistan and India in terms of demographic, is a huge difference. That 10-year difference when it comes to median age and what it means for the demographic curve, what it means for where these countries will be in the year 2040 or 2050. It's a massive difference. And what it actually means is that all of the conversations we're having today and what those conversations mean for those countries are fundamentally different, because the challenges these countries will be facing in a decade and a half and 2 decades are going to be foundationally different. Which brings us back to the idea of this new national security thinking in Pakistan.
Yeah.
If the Pakistani elite, I know that we're running short of time. I'm just going to wrap up in less than 30 seconds. I just think that if the Pakistani elite succeeds in successfully shifting the center of gravity of Pakistani strategy from security to economics, it will be to the benefit not just of Pakistan, but of the entire region. But if it doesn't, then the cost will be paid not just by the people of Pakistan, but by the whole region. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Musharraf, actually, that last point, I think it's also somewhat what even when we talk about the PRI, overall regional connectivity, that the long-term solutions to our security issues and these threats are really economic in many ways. If we improve the quality of lives of people, even if you look at the SCO's mandate, it's about addressing the 3 evil forces, but through holistic means. So I think that especially was a very interesting addition to today's discussion. Now let's invite Wahid Ahmedzai, an entrepreneur, a young Afghan professional based in Beijing for many years. Wahid, can you particularly, you are personally, you are from Afghanistan, you have family there, you've been here for a long time. I think in particular, one dimension that Mr. Zaidi briefly mentioned was also how young the population is and how to really engage that demographic, how integral is that to Afghanistan's future? If you can shed some light on that, and within 8 minutes would be ideal. Thank you so much.
Amazing. First of all, I would like to thank you, Zune and CCG, for organizing this dialogue. I think it's very crucial, especially at this moment, that we raise awareness about what is happening in Afghanistan. And I do hope that Afghanistan should not be forgotten, because we need a collective effort to come out of these crises. Before going into the role of the youth, I still want to go and talk about what are the reasons behind this crisis, because I think we are on the verge of repeating the same mistakes as we did before. I think everybody there's a general consensus that the pseudo-state was supposed to fail sooner or later, but what accelerated this regime fail in Afghanistan, I would say, is like 3 key words for it. So the first one is delegitimization. When US directly signed the peace treaty or a deal with Taliban, and that kind of delegitimized the current regime, the previous regime in Afghanistan. And what it also did is took all the ownership from the Afghan people. to a point that Afghan people didn't feel that they were part of the equation anymore, that they had no more says in that. And the second thing that happened during the past 3 years was the demoralization of the Afghan people, which was also one of the other challenges right now we are currently facing, is that a lot of Afghan talents, and especially the youth, flee the country and are still trying to figure out ways on how to go to other countries. And this is causing a mass exodus and this refugee crisis as well. And one of the biggest reasons, which also kind of, I would say, was a shock and quite disappointing, to especially hear Biden repeatedly say that their mission in Afghanistan was never to do nation building, which means the past 20 years that they stayed in Afghanistan was now, we can pretty much put it as an illegal invasion of Afghanistan if they were never there for nation building. And all the their forced governments, or they forced a coalition government which was based on corruption, also was one of the main reasons why we had such high corruption, and also what accelerated the fall of this regime as well. And the last thing that we are recently seeing is destabilization of Afghanistan, and that's happening again by delegitimizing the claim of Taliban, or not accepting Taliban as a key stakeholder, and every discussion that's being made in here. And that destabilization is impacting our economy. We are seeing a rising inflation during the past few months, even more than 40%. The situation on the ground is actually way worse than some people can see. People are actually committing suicides. There's a really bad humanitarian crisis happening over there. So these are like the three main reasons which accelerated the fall of the regime: the destabilization, demoralization, and delegitimization of Afghan government. And right now we're doing the same mistakes again by delegitimizing the Taliban claim and trying to demoralize the Afghanistan by not directly engaging with them. And the next question would be, is like, how, what certain steps have been taken? I think everybody talked about the humanitarian support, but what I want to focus is the trade support as well. I do hope, despite what happens, we still have like open channels with Afghanistan and engage in trade. Just one example, I was talking to a friend, a trader in Shanghai, and he told me that every carpet sold in here feeds 200 family in Afghanistan for a month. So I think long-term solution is especially, trade under the framework of Belt and Road. So that is very important. And the last one, focusing on the role of the youth, they play a very crucial role in the future of Afghanistan. But right now, one of the biggest challenges for youth is we don't have a youth-centric culture in our countries. Like youth doesn't have a lot of sayings, or doesn't have a lot of authority or power to contribute to some of the policies which are happening, to some of the causes which are being done. So I think one of the good things that can be happen is, I think a CEO or Scholar or this kind of organization is a very good platform for youth to showcase their talents and how they can create impact on a very large level. And we need to slowly build a culture of youth-centric. And that culture can also empower the youth and educate them. And also it's extremely crucial for the youth to advocate for transparency, accountability, and try to strive to build mechanisms that can actually hold the different stakeholders accountable. And also youth should also have a very future-oriented approach toward the nation building. Last thing I want to say is, like, for the past, both of the times why the Ashraf Ghani regime failed, and why right now the Taliban, what they're facing, the challenge that they're facing is lack of narrative, lack of a common narrative, or lack of a common mission between them. And we see that is one of the leading factors why the Ashraf Ghani government failed, because they never could provide a proper description of what is their idea of republic. The same thing is happening with Taliban. They have, despite saying Islamic government, they don't have a proper translation or definition of what is Islamic government. And the best thing for youth can be is, like, they need to come together and try to define what are the values of being Afghan, and define a common mission for Afghanistan, and have a common vision for the future of Afghanistan. And that's, I think, the way forward. I do believe that youth should advocate for transparency. They should advocate for peace. They should advocate for dialogue. And through those dialogues, we can then finally find a long-lasting and a stable solution for our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wahid. There's so much I would like to further elaborate, comment on about what you said, but particularly young people engaging and interacting with each other in the region can solve a lot of problems that especially South Asia is facing. Scholar, like you mentioned, is one initiative. We also have the Global Young Leaders Dialogue powered by CCG, having young people not only be recipients, but also contribute to ways forward. Conceiving a more peaceful and better reality moving forward is something we need more of. Now, let me please invite Dr. Lu Yang of the Belt and Road Institute at Tsinghua University. Dr. Lu Yang has a PhD from Germany, the University of Heidelberg, and she has been working at the Belt and Road Institute at Tsinghua University for a few years. Her focus is South Asia and Europe. So Dr. Lu Yang, any comments on the discussion, your thoughts, and any possible recommendations? Because I feel like today's discussion has been a lot of very, very valuable perspectives and also solutions, but it still seems like the situation is just so complex. Maybe tangible ways forward, if you could think of or suggest any, would also be great.
Thank you for the invitation from Zon and CCG, and thank you for all the panelists for sharing your views on the development of Afghanistan. Currently, the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan would be the largest. I would say that it will surpass like Iraq, Libya, and Ethiopia. So we have a lot of discussion right now, but it seems that there's still we cannot find a better ways. I think today in the panelists, you have all the panelists have already addressed the history and current situation. On the problem of Afghanistan it were projects in the future, and it needs time to rebuild the country for the state building. I think one of the panelists, Mr. Tahit, also pointed out the failure of the elites in the region to address the challenges. But we talk a lot about the Afghans-led and Afghan-owned peace-building process. And also in many speeches and documents, we emphasize the people of Afghanistan. However, there's so many things that we just see the people of Afghanistan is missing. And can the Taliban represent current Afghan people? And this is also questions by the international society. This is why currently there needs some new thinking on how to solve the problem of Afghanistan. And we also know that all the stakeholders, including the countries in the regions as well as outside regions, have talked many rounds, but the things that we really need to put the people of Afghanistan at the center. This is the way of. This is why we can achieve the humanitarian efforts together. And on the BRI, there's another speaker's address that economic perspective is very important. I agreed with that. For example, so recently China imports peanuts, nuts from Afghanistan. There's a trade support is also very important. And also some speakers addressed China should let these the peacekeeping process, like Professor Mahoney. But I would say that in whole situation, in general, China is like others stakeholders in the regions and trying to keep the stability and trying to put more economic supports to the region. But if we talk about Belt and Road Initiative and the construction there, only we can only achieve a stable Afghanistan, then we can do more constructions and together. This is why it is a deadlock or dilemma. I would say that China is doing its parts, and all the regional countries should do their parts. And there's some emergent non-security issues, non-traditional security issues in the region as well. Maybe the regional countries could establish or design some infrastructures or security architecture to address these issues. And thank you very much for the invitation and the discussion today. I will give the floor back to Zoom.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lu Yang. I will comment on your discussion points. I really quickly want to invite Andy Mock. Andy, are you with us?
Yes.
Hi, I'm so sorry about this, Andy. No introduction. You don't need one. Please start. I know you have a call shortly, very soon.
Okay, no, thank you, Zoon. So thank you so much for such an informative and impactful panel. I'll just keep my remarks very, very short. I think we heard that about the urgent crisis facing Afghanistan, as well as the wicked longer-term structural issues. And some of the challenges I think that China would have to address to be more engaged. So I just want to very briefly say three things: that if, and maybe this is a big if, that these issues can be overcome and China can engage with Afghanistan, that this could be valuable and even transformative for Afghanistan and the region. And some of this may sound a bit aspirational, but I think hopefully we can end on a positive note here. That first of all, China's philosophy is trade, not aid, or we call it win-win, which sometimes has been misconstrued. But this is the only sustainable way to work with countries, where instead of just being a donor, that it has to be mutually beneficial. And we see this with poverty alleviation. We see what China's doing in Africa, in Iraq, in terms of providing economic opportunities such as green channels for African imports, which was recently announced at FOCAC. And the area that I focus on is technology and its impact on international relations. And I think, again, here, the word I would use is aspirational, but also practical. And when we look at e-commerce as a way that, again, if these problems can be addressed in China and Chinese enterprises can engage more fully with Afghanistan, that e-commerce, live streaming, drone deliveries to rural areas without good roads can be an enormous positive factor. The second thing, technology-wise, that I think can be very positive is the convergence between digital and financial inclusion. So we know that Afghanistan, like other parts of the developing world, literacy, especially for females, for women, is a big challenge. So getting internet access through inexpensive smartphones is vital. But when we look at convergence of digital and financial inclusion, with especially the digital yuan, that allows small businesses, especially started by women, to access financial services, again, could be transformative. When we look at some of the challenges facing Afghanistan that we heard about in terms of corruption, the digital yuan can play a role in this as well. So we know one of the challenges with aid that causes hesitancy as well as ineffectiveness of aid is leakage through corruption, other issues. And the digital yuan can address factors like that. And then lastly, what we've seen in COVID-19 is the acceleration in China of telemedicine, especially powered by 5G. So again, look at things like e-commerce, digital inclusion, financial inclusion, other technological advances. I think that can play a transformative role for Afghanistan and the region, assuming, again, this big if some of these challenges that the other experts raised can be addressed. So Zun, again, thank you so much for the opportunity. Really fantastic panel. I really have to go, but thank you for making the time for me to share some thoughts.
Thank you so much, Andy. I think you've given us more discussion points for another round. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Okay, so now it is actually 12, the time that we scheduled. We will end the panel. But if everyone is okay with that, and if we have the speakers' consent, the panelists' consent, then maybe we can go for a quick 2 minutes each, because a lot of solutions were also proposed. I think there were many views that perhaps you may want to respond to from another panelist. And I do think that at the end of the day, today's discussion is really about dissecting core issues, understanding different perspectives, and really seeing how these can come together and create room for concerted and immediate efforts for something that we all realize the situation in Afghanistan is going to have lasting consequences if it is left unaddressed. So at the end of the day, we, like international stakeholders, governments of countries in the region and beyond, we need to look for solutions and fast solutions. So in this conversation, if we can come closer to that, it would be very helpful. So I would request that maybe let's start with Ambassador Umar Samad. If there are any points another panelist raised, any follow-up comments within 2 minutes would be ideal. Please.
Thank you so much again. And I will take this occasion before my time runs out here, close to midnight Washington time.
Oh, thank you.
But I want to thank everyone for some very insightful, valuable input and their thoughts about not only what is happening and how do they see the Afghan situation from their angle, but also on the broader perspective, regional and beyond. And we all, I think, realize that Afghanistan is in a very odd situation for any nation or nation state to be in, very unusual, very abnormal, and very unique. I'm not sure exactly how many such cases we've had in history, but it's obviously a very interesting case for scholars and for practitioners, quite a challenge. As an Afghan, I and many others struggle every day to figure out what needs to be done, and obviously each party, each stakeholder has to figure out what needs to be done or what should be done or not be done from their own perspective. One thing that stands out is that we need out-of-the-box solutions. We need innovative type of ideas, and I heard several of those here today, and I really thank you. And I took notes here to make sure that at least I can share those within my Afghan networks, including Afghan media, to which I have access occasionally. And it's important that we put, when we talk about Afghanistan, I think it is important that we put the Afghan people at the center. And I think it is very important that we put sovereignty also on top of our list, knowing that sovereignty has been eroded over time, over 4 decades, by so many different events that have taken place. But, you know, one of the biggest problems with the failures and some of the successes we've all had, separately or collectively, has to do with the fact that we haven't really understood the country very well. It's a very complex country. We haven't really understood its people. its demographics, its cultural, historical. You know, a lot has been written about Afghanistan. A lot has been studied about Afghanistan, going back even to British colonial times. But a lot of it, or I would say almost entirely, with few exceptions, are all written by Westerners or non-Afghans or people who are not from the immediate region, who can probably have a different understanding of the complexities and sensitivities that exist. And I think, you know, I see so many people. I've traveled quite a bit, and I've come across a lot of people who look at Afghanistan from the point of view of what a British, you know, colonial general wrote, or somebody, or a Soviet scholar wrote about Afghanistan. So I think we need more understanding going forward, and things have changed as well. So things in Afghanistan are not static. And with the emergence of the Taliban 27 years ago, and now their control of the country after a lot of bloodshed on all sides, we need to find peace in Afghanistan. We need stability. I think it's absolutely essential that we need to work towards peace and stability, and we need to work towards a Afghan ownership. And Afghan ownership can mean so many things. It has to involve the Afghan people. It cannot be top down. It cannot be imposed anymore on Afghanistan, as has been the case. The communists tried to impose things that the Afghan people did not agree with. The Mujahideen who came after that were so split into 15 factions that obviously it led to a civil war. The Taliban who came afterwards and replaced them brought such a distraction and such a different viewpoint to Afghanistan that an average Afghan didn't recognize exactly what Islam meant anymore, or what being an Afghan meant anymore, with the Taliban of the 1990s. And then with the American intervention and Western intervention, which initially was an international intervention, but it became in my view, a money-making, unfortunately, a money-making enterprise under the guise of a military presence fighting terrorism, so on and so forth. So we didn't really understand the country very well. If we had, we wouldn't have had the events of the last few months. And moving forward, I think we need to engage as much as we can, and we need to study as much as we can, and we need to come up with solutions that are practical and involve those who are stakeholders. And I very much, again, welcome the views that have been given by our Chinese colleagues and others, and our Pakistani brothers and sisters, and others who obviously whose own situation very much depends on what's happening in Afghanistan, especially for Pakistan. And I hope that moving forward, Pakistan and Afghanistan develop a new paradigm in order to deal with their issues. So thank you again. I'm probably not going to stay very long with you, but I very much appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And I think on the last note, the last point that you mentioned, that shift towards geoeconomics could be one that can be transformative for both Pakistan and Afghanistan. We really have a symbiotic relationship. So I hope that in itself can drive us towards better solutions, more solutions, and mutually beneficial ways forward. Thank you. So I have a quick question. Are other speakers, because I just received a message from Mr. Ijaz Heather that you have another event. So if you would like to, if other speakers are okay with that, we will take everyone's consent. Then maybe Mr. Heather can go first. if you would like to briefly respond to any of the other speakers. Mr. Ijaz Haider, are you here? If everyone's okay with that. No. Okay, no objections. You can raise your hand. This is okay. Please, Mr. Haider. Thank you.
No, I have a very sick dog that needs to be tended to.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, he got poisoned a few days ago. So anyway, look, there are wishes and there are is's. And I think going forward, Afghanistan will either become a counterterrorism problem, or it can become a state with which other states can deal with in terms of, trade and investment and the rest of it. And of course, the BRI vision also came up. Pakistan is looking for connectivity, and Afghanistan becomes a very important part of that. So the hope, the wish is that Afghanistan does not become a counterterrorism problem. I think central to the irony of Afghanistan, and Musharraf mentioned this in terms of the international system, was a book that Ashraf Ghani wrote with Claire Lockhart, and it was called Fixing Failed States, a framework for rebuilding a fractured world. It was like a book. It was a much celebrated book. And yet, the very man who wrote this book presided in many ways over the destruction or the, shall I say, the unraveling of the state that the international community tried to put together. Musharraf also talked about sovereignty. I believe that sovereignty is a function of certain other things a state can and must do. If a state cannot do those things, then it cannot lay claim to sovereignty, especially if it has people on its soil that are hurting, for instance, the interests of other states. And I'm not just referring to Pakistan, but also other regional states. I heard Wahid, it was extremely moving. I really appreciate the views that he presented in terms of the common Afghan men and women. And I think that humanitarian aspect is very important. But at the same time, there are certain people who are de facto in power in Afghanistan. And the decision to make it less painful for the Afghans primarily lies with them. How much the rest of the world, whether regional countries or extra-regional countries, can do for the Afghans, who of course need massive humanitarian help, will also be determined, fortunately or unfortunately, by the actions of the people who are ruling Afghanistan right now. So I think, as I said earlier, it is, to a very large extent, it will be decided by the Taliban de facto interim government where they want to take the country and whether the country becomes a counterterrorism problem or it can become a state with which other states can deal with. And I think if it's the latter, then one can hope for the kind of solutions that have been presented here, whether they were in terms of connectivity, trade, investment, humanitarian aid, tapping into the very potential of the Afghan youth, and Musharraf mentioned the median age. It cannot simply be the desire of the other states to do that. You have to have a corresponding, enabling environment within Afghanistan in order for that to happen. So these were some of the thoughts that I wanted to put before you, because solutions cannot happen in a vacuum. And one can present solutions in terms of how the youth can be tapped into, what kind of opportunities one can bring to them, how much the other countries can do in terms of helping the Afghans. But at the end of the day, it's about the people who are ruling Afghanistan. And I think that is where the focus needs to be. And it's a dilemma. And I think Pakistan's official approach right now in terms of focusing on the humanitarian crisis and ignoring for the time being various other issues is correct. But as we move forward, those other issues will keep cropping up. And I think at some point, one will have to create a balance between what one wants to do for Afghanistan and what it is that one expects from Afghanistan that it can do for others. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jad. I think that's the conversations we are having can maybe give incentives to governments and the Taliban as you speak as well, but acting on these incentives and potentials is something that will have to be mutual. And being able to deal with an Afghanistan that is conducive to the long-term perspective and more economic cooperation and connectivity in the region will be absolutely vital in that. So thank you so much. Professor Joseph Mahoney, your thoughts, responses, and potential solutions. You're muted.
So I just have three quick comments. The first is to respond to something that Jalhai said. He's absolutely correct that the negative or the generally negative image that Afghanistan and in particular the Taliban have among the Chinese people is a major concern. Most of China's foreign policy begins with its perception among the domestic audience, and this is not something that's well understood internationally. There's this sort of mythos that Beijing just does whatever it wants and doesn't really care about what anyone thinks in China, but that's precisely the opposite. So if China is going to take a leadership role, and I think it must, and I think it's the only one who really can, there will need to be some concerted effort to explain to the Chinese people why this is in their interest, and to do that sooner rather than later. But this problem isn't limited to China. It's also something that if you watch Russian media and other places, there's a tremendous amount of negative narratives about what's going on in Afghanistan, the threat of future terrorism, and so forth and so on. And there will need to be some sort of talk back and discussion of this in order for positive things to move forward. The second point is the comment, trade, not aid. And although that is, I think it was Andy Mock who raised that. But it's clear at this point, as others have discussed, that trade is not going to grow until more stability and legitimacy is there. So we have an emergent concern where direct aid is going to be necessary. And although that will, I agree that has a bilateral component, I do think it needs to be organized through and sort of authorized and accounted by a multilateral effort. The third point is, although the threat of repercussions related to the sanctions seems to have been mitigated somewhat recently, we should expect no substantial support from the United States in dealing with this problem going forward, for two reasons. I agree with the idea that the U.S., and not to be conspiratorial, but I agree that the U.S. Has a strategic interest in the mess that it has left behind. And it's a mess that really serves their containment strategy towards China and trying to undermine the BRI and the strong relationship between China and Pakistan and China's plans in Central Asia. But in addition to this, the U.S. is done with Afghanistan. There's this idea that that the U.S. went in and tried to save these people, but they were impossible to save, that they are in some way fundamentally, morally, culturally incompetent. The U.S. spent trillions of dollars and all for naught. So the U.S. feels like it's, or at least it's presented itself as this sort of great humanitarian that did its best to save Afghanistan from itself. And now the U.S. is, of course, struggling to save itself from itself. Biden can't even get his funding packages through Congress. So I don't think we should expect anything of substance from the U.S. And maybe even some of the other Western countries. I do think that this needs to be and will have to be an Asian-led. And when I say Asian, I also mean the Gulf and the other countries east of let's say Greece. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mahoney. Dr. Zhao.
I won't repeat many of the good points that others have already stated. I just want to emphasize one thing, that ultimately, Afghanistan will have to solve their own problem. Foreign aid is not a solution. Actually, the longer the foreign aid pouring in, the more dependent they will be on those foreign aids, and that will actually distort the economic structure of Afghanistan. In the long run, I mean, in the past 20 years, if you remember, Afghanistan's population increased, basically doubled, and many of those people actually now crowded in the mega cities in the Afghanistan, and those people are very much dependent upon foreign aid, Western money that's actually coming into this country without asking for trade or other compensation. So if we expect no more aid from the United States or EU or other countries, other than a very small portion of humanitarian aid, then the fundamental structure of Afghanistan's economy must be transformed in order to support future state building in that country. So at this point, it's very important for the current administrators to reduce the size of the cities. Otherwise, those young people crowded in the city without a job will be a rich ground, rich environment for poverty, violence, ultimately terrorism. So I think it's very important to manage the economy very carefully and to build the economy from the bottom up, including agriculture, low-level manufacturing, and also mining. So, starting from the scratch and helping to feed the people first, instead of, continue to pour resource into these big cities that's been left behind by NATO and other Western powers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zhao. Musharraf Zaidi, Mr. Musharraf, your comments. Any final comments, responses, possibly solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think just responding to the point about Western and particularly U.S. engagement and, whether Afghanistan and its people can fend for themselves. I don't think they can. I think that's been proven. And I also think that given the almost frankly, anybody that cares for Afghanistan for the last few weeks, we've waited desperately for what happened this week with the Treasury Department changing, some of the rules and allowing for transactions between individuals and organizations and those agencies, both international and NGOs that are working to support the Afghan people. I just think that the centrality of the US system in terms of how the global economy works and how local economies will work in Afghanistan and in the region continues to be large enough that even China can't ignore it. And I think that what that means is that in order for there to be peace and stability in places like Afghanistan, and I would argue even in places like Pakistan, some sort of a global compact that allows these countries' peoples to grow and to thrive and to flourish without having to choose a side between China and the US is actually going to be instrumental. I think that the choice that the US has made to go headlong into a conflict with China is one that is going to necessitate a Chinese response. But by no means should that dynamic between China and the US or US and China be a cause for people in Afghanistan to starve. And I think for me, the big takeaway is how can we forge some sort of a regional and global compact that affords people to grow their economies, to run businesses, and to flourish without necessarily choosing a side between China and the US. Thanks.
So we need more pragmatism, I think, in the end, and practical solutions. Wahid, the final word is yours.
All right, I will try to summarize. I would say, going forward, the main responsibility for rebuilding the nation is mostly on two parties. The first one is the youth. It's up to us to redefine what it means to be an Afghan, what are our values, and what is our goal and vision for our country, for our future. And another thing is also we need to strive to build a youth-centric effort toward nation building. I think that's really important. The youth-centric word is really crucial, because we have a culture that right now doesn't allow you to really prosper and contribute to these efforts. The second most important party is still Taliban. I think Taliban main responsibility is toward the people of Afghanistan. Instead of focusing too much on how to get international recognition, they should still try to figure out how to get internal integration and how to provide even the basic facilities, healthcare, and everything toward the people of Afghanistan. And that might be a catalyst for them to, they need to set up a proper constitution, whether in forms of lawyer jirga or on any other way. And having a proper constitution or having a clear definition of what they want to do, what are the rules of this country, and what will be the basic principles for managing, governing this country might be a good basis to gain the international recognition as well. And last one, I totally agree with Professor Joseph that the US is totally done with Afghanistan. And I think with that, I just want to add is right now, right now that we are on this brink of economic collapse, the Afghanistan assets which are frozen by US is also a big pain, and it's only adding to pain and suffering of the people of Afghanistan. So another thing we might need to focus is what are the right mechanism and how we can use those assets to rebuild the infrastructure of Afghanistan economy. And yes, I totally agree that we cannot rely on aid in long term, and I do believe that trade is a better option, but we also need the basic investment, and those assets could be really crucial. Despite it's around $10 billion, which will only last maybe 1.5 years. Based on last year's fiscal budget was $6.6 billion, so 10 billions will only last us 1.5 years, but that's enough for us to at least drive the economy for the next 1.5 years and see where we can go forward with that. With that, I really do hope that we continue discussing about Afghanistan, that we have more dialogues about Afghanistan. And I think the people of Afghanistan needs the world to stand in solidarity with them. Afghans are a very proud but very grateful nation. And in long term, I do believe that we're going to contribute to this world, and we're going to contribute to the betterment and development of this world as well. And thank you for CCG and Zoom for having us.
Thank you so much, Wahid, and thank you to all of our panelists and also the discussants. Today's purpose is really to deepen our understanding about what is happening. We all realize that the situation is urgent, requires proactive measures from the region, from the global community, and also innovative solutions. So really what we set out to achieve and especially as Center for China and Globalization, our purpose is to broaden discussions that can deepen cooperation, mutual understanding, and also innovative solutions between China and the region. So with that, I think, yes, we have been able to address many of the questions, understand some root problems. Many of the topics, many of the solutions brought up also overlapped, and these can be worked on, like Ambassador Umar Samad also mentioned. Maybe some things can be discussed with stakeholders who are in a position to make decisions. So I hope that this conversation has been as fruitful and insightful for our viewers as it has been for me, and also for our panelists as it has been for me. And I hope that we can really work towards at least encouraging better consensus and lasting solutions in the country. With that, we have to conclude our discussion, but the conversation will continue. Thank you so much for participating, and I hope that we can have a second round in a short period soon, and really see how maybe more concrete ways forward can be conceived and suggested to people who can take them forward. So with that, goodbye.